Another area in which the Arabs make monumentally important innovations is the area of agriculture. And this again is interesting and shows the extraordinary creative dynamism of early Islamic civilization. Not only did they take to the seas with great aptitude, something that they'd never done before. Exactly why there's so much seafaring imagery in the Quran, by the way, which there is still something of a mystery for scholars. We don't quite know why it's there. But agriculture is, again, something that the Arabs, as a largely nomadic, arid or semi-arid population, didn't know too much about. There were some plantations in Medina and a few other oases, a certain amount of cultivation of dates and also of wheat. But one of the interesting innovations that happen after the Arab conquests is not the desertification of the old world, but actually the blossoming of agriculture and the introduction of new agricultural innovations. One reason, again, is the abolition of the feudal system, so that peasants were no longer inserfed, which meant that there was a proliferation of small holdings. Taxes on land were substantially lower than they'd been under the Byzantines. Usually this went under the name of Kharaj, rather vaguely defined in early Islamic law, but generally about 10% of a land's revenue would go to the state, which is not very much. So agriculture starts to become more profitable. And another reason for the development of agricultural profitability is the sudden expansion of major cities. Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba were really the megacities of their day. And they had to be surrounded, given that there was no refrigeration, by intensive market gardens whose produce could be taken into, particularly dairy goods and milk, into the city within a short period without spoiling. So in that world, it could be enormously profitable to be an agriculturalist with a market garden within, say, 10 miles or so of one of these expanding cities. Where did the Arabs get their methods of irrigation? Well, mostly they're not original, but adapted from pre-existing forms practiced on a smaller scale. In Syria, some fairly sophisticated techniques of irrigation were adopted by the Arabs, and their introduction into Spain contributes to the rapid growth of the country's population under Muslim rule. And there's evidence for this in the very considerable intrusion of Arabic vocabulary into agricultural language in Spain, or even in this part of the world, because of course these methods were introduced into New Spain as well. So just at the bottom of the road here you'll see one of these, Acequia, which is a drainage ditch, which comes from the Arabic Acequia, which means the same thing. Also, I think in New Mexico you'll find occasionally this thing, which is a pool, Albesca, which comes from the Arabic albirka, which just means a pool used for conserving water to be used for agriculture. A cistern, I don't know if these words are really archaic or not, but they were there in the Middle Ages. Al-khibe, a cistern. Noria, which is a water wheel. Alcantarilla, which is a sewer or a little bridge or a culvert. More obscure term, but also important. Alcorque, if that's the pronunciation, another Arabic word, meaning a kind of plaster sill around the trunk of a tree in order to hold in water. And there's plenty of other examples. So the agricultural technology comes from Syria via the Arabs. Amy?
I have a question about the Kharaj, which you said is a type of tax. Mm-hmm. During the Abbasid Empire, did all of the collection go to the caliphate in Baghdad, or was it localized in the current republic for the pseudo? I mean, I'm confused. You mentioned in some of your first lectures that it's not centralized power, but it seems that I listened to you that there is some type of centralized intellectual, economic, and political power in Baghdad.
Yeah, the Baghdad caliphate really absorbed the Persian idea of a very centralized government. And in theory, the tribute was all paid to the central government, and often it was. During the first 10 Abbasid caliphs who sometimes informally in Islamic history we call the A-team of the Abbasids, because they were all really successful rulers, that the tribute would be sent to the central government and then distributed centrally. And the Ottomans have a slightly different system in that they would have what they call tax farming, relics of that still persistent parts of the Middle East, whereby you would buy, through a lump sum, the right to acquire the revenues of a particular estate for the rest of your life, which is a different sort of arrangement. Yeah.
One of the things that links this together is kind of interesting. One of Alan Gracie's major resources for understanding the geography of that area was that he got a hold of tax collectors' records and knew exactly which cities were where and how to get to them. Because the tax collectors drew maps of how to get to different places around that region.
Yeah.
Well, I'd be interested to know how that affected the religious life.
Right.
I know you said that the religious life, the ideological conquest followed an economic and political conquest. So if taxes affected economic conquest, in what way did the caliphate in Baghdad affect the religious life eventually of people during this time?
Right. Well, I'll talk a bit about intellectual history in the second half of this lecture, but briefly what happened was that the caliph, although he was the titular head of the religion, his name would be mentioned in the Friday prayers throughout his domains, his name would appear on coinage, nonetheless didn't really have executive religious authority to tell people what to believe or how to practice. He could on occasion be the court of final appeal, but generally his religious interventions would only take place if there was armed insurrection in the provinces, which usually took place under the banner of a religious interpretation. So that Umayyads and the early Abbasids faced as their principal internal threat the Kharijites in southern Iraq and Khuzestan were constantly rebelling, claiming that the caliph wasn't pious enough. And then he would certainly unfurl the banner of the Prophet and declare a jihad, and would be enforcing a particular version of the religion on that basis. But generally, the caliphs didn't get involved in pushing religious opinion or the scholars one way or another. And generally the scholars, particularly in the early period, kept their distance from the caliphs. They thought that the caliphs were too soft and decadent, and that it was inappropriate for a religious scholar to be financed by the state. And some of the early religious scholars were actually persecuted by the caliphs for not supplying legal judgments to their taste. So the idea of church and state being the same thing in early Islam couldn't be more wrong. It wasn't really theocratic in, say, the Byzantine state model, or even Aquinas' idea of the ideal Christian state. Generally, there was quite a lot of tension between the religious scholars and the political elite.